like to welcome you to. I would like to welcome you to give us the acknowledgement of the country.
Thank you. Thank you. So to commence this event, I would like to acknowledge my brothers and sisters, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, who have lived on the land that I'm on today and the land of this conference is being held on in person for many thousands of years, belonging to country, caring for country, being cared for by country. I acknowledge their custodianship of country and pay my respects to their ancestors, past, present, and emerging.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ian. You will be the next speaker after we do the quick introductions. Now, we wanted to give the overview of the projects. What is this project about, and what process did we consider to take? With that, I would like to welcome Enqi to give us the introduction of this conference or on this project. So Enqi, welcome.
Thanks so much. Well, I really want to begin with a very warm welcome to each and every one of you for responding with such enthusiasm when we invited you to present and participate in this 1.5-day workshop. This project and workshop has been made possible thanks to a seed grant from the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization here at Deakin University. Now, in this introduction, I just want to share a bit about the aims and inspiration of this project before I hand the mic over to Rosie, who has been working on some of the lit review for this project. And then I will give you a brief overview of how we have organized this workshop. So very briefly, this project aims to investigate the transnational flows of religions across the Indian and Pacific Oceans between Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Now, based on the research that some of us in the organizing team have done, which I will get to, historical and contemporary studies of religion in Australia have largely focused on flows of the so-called Abrahamic faith, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, from the global north, with particular emphasis also on the southern states of Victoria and New South Wales. Consequently, what has been overlooked are the early waves of migration of diverse religious traditions from Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands, and their relations with Indigenous and European Australians, particularly in Australia's far north. Now, as sociologists of religion, we think that this marginalization and the construction of this white Christian nation, largely through the White Australia policy, has ongoing consequences not only for interreligious relations in Australia, but also within religious communities across intersectional differences. So with that bit of a background in mind, our aim for the workshop is to gather local and international colleagues working in these spaces to critically reflect on the place, presence, and infusion of coloniality in historical and contemporary religious experiences, and to locate sites of resistance in transnational life worlds. Now, we kind of included that digitality as a possible angle, but I'm not sure really if any presenters are going to be addressing that, and hopefully there will be. In particular, we are interested in the flows of religion across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, like I said, between Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, and together and in dialogue with one another, we aim to locate the place of coloniality in studies of religion and work towards building a more inclusive future in policies and practice. Now, the research intent and direction of this workshop is pretty much situated in a broader context of a turn in academia towards decolonizing research. And in this case, for our purposes, the studies of religion. The concept of religion has traditionally been dominated by European Western thoughts and influences, where much of the scholarship in this area developed during the period of modernity and colonialism. And to date, Australian census and Australian research on religion continue to rely on Western indices to identify and understand Australian religiosity. Now, this approach requires new consideration in the light of, recent re-examination of Australia's history, religious history, as well as in the face of increasing cultural and religious diversity and considerations of the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, and culture. We have also intentionally included a session that includes our colleagues from theology, who I think, as sociologists from the Alfred Deakin Institute, have much to learn from, given their very practical outputs and the immediate challenges they face in their lived religious realities. So these are really just some of the initial questions that we used to guide this workshop, in how we selected our presenters, and in who we invited to participate in these discussions. And we really may not have covered all of them in the presentations. But we do hope that these questions can be used to guide us in our collective dialogue. So some of these questions, as you can see on the screen, are how do colonial ideologies persist in practice and policy in lived religious and community groups in these areas? How have colonial ideologies been challenged historically in these communities? Where are the sites of ongoing contestations of colonial ideologies within these communities? And, does digital media play any role in these contestations? What challenges and opportunities are present and persist in multicultural religious communities, especially in the areas of leadership and mentoring? And finally, what do contestations between Indigenous belief and colonially imported religion, mainly Christianity, look like in the various areas of art, music, trade, and education? Now, there are two main emphases, for this project. And I just want to talk through a little bit about these two main inspirations. And the first is really a project that took a historical approach to understanding religious diversity in a far north of Australia, similarly funded by ADI, led by Anna Helhoff, who's here today, of which I worked on as a researcher. And the project sought to retell the history of Buddhism in Australia, centering the significant and enduring presence and contribution of Asian workers and migrants, and in particular the Chinese, Japanese, and Sri Lankan communities who lived and practiced their religions in Australia pre-World War II. Now, the project draws inspiration from Regina Genter's 2005 article, where she said that instead of a white Australian past in the north, we see a history of mixed relations. And indeed, she concluded that if we start to write Australian history from north to south, instead of the other way around, we must straight away give up the idea of Anglo-Celts at the center of the Australian universe. Now, this forthcoming paper is documented strong material records of lived religious beliefs and rituals present not only in temples, sacred trees, cemeteries, and personal shrines, but also in people's livelihoods and economic successes, as some of the pictures that Anna, I think, took are presented here today. This heritage has been preserved in museums in the far north as the heritage of immigrant groups who moved to Australia, but are actually hardly recognized and used as data as part of Australian religious heritage. As such, the paper concludes that it is because of European Protestant bias that informs what has historically been counted as a religion in Australia, and that further contributes to the construction of the myth of Australia as a white Christian nation. Now, the second inspiration comes from a recent ARC discovery project titled Religious Diversity in Australia, Maintaining Social Cohesion and Preventing Violence, which is led by Doug Ezzi in the University of Tasmania, Greg Barton and Anna Helhoff at Deakin, the late Gary Balmer from Monash University, Laurie Beeman at University of Ottawa, and Bob Jackson from the University of Warwick. There are 6 streams in this project, and the migration stream, which was led by Greg and Anna, which I worked on as a researcher, is where we studied contemporary migration and considered how religion and spirituality can simultaneously support and disrupt settlement and sense of belonging for migrants. And so one of the research outputs was a paper that we focused on the experiences of African Australians, which William Abur was a co-author on this paper, where we heard stories about racial discrimination, that still occurs, that this community faced from within their own religious and spiritual communities when they were, most leaning on them for support. Now, for this particular paper, we're very much inspired by Ghassan Hajar's book, White Nation, Fantasies of White Supremacy in a Multicultural Society, where he argued that whiteness is a critical defining aspect of Australian leadership, governance, and institutions. And this proximity to this whiteness in terms of culture, in terms of visibility, especially for non-whites, kind of imbue them with social qualities that make them more white and by that token more Australian. Now, there's been a lot of research done in the multicultural space that have documented various struggles, discriminations endured by different ethnic communities throughout waves of migration into Australia as they try to find their place and belonging in white Australia. So in this paper, we argue that there is much that Australian leadership and institutions can learn from the quality of African togetherness, and in recognizing the decolonial, diverse, and relational ways of being that can be present in culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse Australia, rather than the socially and politically constructed racist colonial myth of a white Christian nation. And it is really in this paper that I think that have sort of inspired us to consider alternative ways of being and to ask how a decolonial approach to the study of religion can contribute or may contribute to a healthier, more caring, and genuinely inclusive Australian society, which emphasizes a collective, complex, and plural we rather than a simplistic, normative us versus them. I want to hand over to Rosie for a bit before I jump back in. She's going to talk us through some key points, that she's picked up in her reading of the literature at this point.
Thank you, Enqi. As I prepared a literature review for Enqi, what I appreciated was the absolute width of the literature that was presented to me, covering theory, history, sociology, ethnomusicology, and a little bit of theology as well. I was excited by how much of it was new to me, which was also daunting. And so the challenge, of course, was kind of working out a way to put it together into something cohesive. And to meet that challenge, I attempted to map out some key themes. And at the moment, the 4 key themes in my map are: what is it to decolonize an academic discipline? What is it to specifically decolonize the study of religion in Australia? Locating coloniality, and decentering or dislocating coloniality. This is a space that I've been thinking in for about 6 minutes, and I fully accept that people here have been thinking about this for a long time. So I'm just going to be speaking really briefly about some of the things that I've put into this map, and for me they're still really very open sections. So what is it to, and this is my only slide, so and, here we are. What is it to decolonize an academic discipline? Here I read things like Raymond Connell's Using Southern Theory, Decolonizing Social Theory, Research and Application, Mallory Nye's Decolonizing the Study of Religion, and Yin Paradies' Unsettling Truths, Modernity, Decoloniality, and Indigenous Futures. Broadly, we can say that to decolonize is to intentionally acknowledge colonial violence, past and continuing, and to commit to a future that's different from that past. What stood out to me as I read this body of work was that for us as researchers, decolonial practice is about doing knowledge production differently and doing that intentionally, and that it's an everyday practice that ideally any and all of us can be doing. Common strategies for this included purposeful citational practices and critical rereading of classic texts. Feminist theorist Sara Ahmed, who I am such a fangirl of, has written of the ways in which racist and sexist citational policies act as barriers and walls within academic departments and disciplines. Ahmed contends that when citational practices become habits, bricks form walls. So for me, to decolonize is about being in the business of removing walls. To engage in decolonial readings, we need to be self-reflexive and willing to ask, how did I and my discipline come to have certain knowledge? How did my discipline come to assert certain theories as good, plausible, or even true? Here we can learn from Wiradjuri academic Sandy O'Sullivan in their discussion of the need for museum curators to be in respectful and ongoing relationship with relevant communities when they are in their collections and presentation of artifacts and First Nations cultures. Attending to O'Sullivan's critique, we might ask of ourselves and the work that we cite, is there a relationship between the researcher and the community? Is it healthy and respectful, or does it further colonial violence? Turning to that second point, in thinking about what it might mean specifically to decolonise sociology of religion in Australia, a significant theme that emerged was acknowledging the ways in which religion is not only a contested term, but a term which has been used to maintain colonial power and racist hierarchies. So a self-reflexive decolonial approach to the study of religion lends itself to a consideration of how the term religion and the study of religion has been weaponized in the hands of colonizers. In Western context, the term religion often carries, as I'm sure we all know, a European and Protestant bias. Paul Hedges reminds us that in the 18th and 19th centuries, what was counted as religion or dismissed as superstition often depended on what looked familiar to Protestant missionaries and colonial administrators. Protestantism typically remains the standard against which other practices, behaviours, and cultures are read and either deemed religion or relegated to a sphere of non-religion through the use of other terms such as magic, superstition, witchcraft, and potentially even spirituality. We might see more things as religious if we let ourselves be informed by thinking which resists purely European lenses. So Anglican theologian and Trelawney man Gary Deverell suggests that in Australian discussions, spirituality most often refers to a special kind of personal or private experience by which the spirit engages with a mystical and otherworldly realm of pure spirit. Deverell says that he'd prefer to use the word in a more Jewish and Aboriginal sense, spirituality as an entirely ordinary, irreducibly earthly way of life that is nevertheless informed and enabled by the Spirit of God. Deverell highlights that for Aboriginal peoples, spirituality is all about the most basic building blocks of life, country, kin, and the practice of ritual storytelling that weaves past, present, and future living together in a web sometimes referred to as the dreaming. Eileen Morton Robinson makes a similar point in Talking Up the White Woman, writing, unlike the white constructions of Christian spirituality, Indigenous spirituality encompasses the intersubstantiation of ancestral beings, humans, and physiography. The spiritual world is immediately experienced because it is synonymous with the physiography of the land. So for me, I think it really matters that religion is a category prioritized in Western sociology and theology, which is historically focused on beliefs of the individual, while in these accounts by Aboriginal scholars, spirituality, which is centered on relationality and connection between individuals, community, and land, is the priority. This leads me to the third section in the map, which is locating coloniality. I think that for some of us, it can be easy to skip over this, but it's crucial that we don't. If we're intentionally going to decenter white and Western modes of thinking within the sociology of religion, particularly in this continent, it's important to name that the arrival of European religion, namely Christianity, in these lands is enmeshed with imperialism and colonization. Deverell employed this amazing term, strategic forgetting, to describe the ways that dominant forms of Christian theology in Australia continue to uphold colonial violence. In order to remedy that forgetting, we as academics, and particularly those of us who are white people, need to locate the contours of colonialism and colonial power that exist within the study and the practice of religion, specifically Christianity. Auntie Dr. Anne Patel-Gray, who we'll be hearing from later this morning, told us over 20 years ago that Australian governments and churches were in collusion, working together to facilitate Aboriginal dispossession. Morton Robinson also bears witness to this, documenting the role of the church missions in breaking up Aboriginal family groups, while O'Sullivan describes the church requiring Aboriginal peoples to conform to the Western ideal of the nuclear family as a form of ongoing colonial violence. Historians Piggin and Linda, church historians, who are mostly very positive about the ways that evangelicalism has shaped contemporary Australia, still write of British imperialism and evangelical Christianity as parallel empires. Meredith Lake shows us that in Australia, the Bible was used as a colonizing text, yet at the same time, no one owned the text, and it's a multicultural text which has been used both to advance colonial power and to resist it. So William Cooper, a Yorta Yorta man, used Christianity as a mode of resistance to colonialism nearly 100 years ago. And I wish so much that I had learnt that at primary school, or maybe at church as a teenager, and not, in recent years as an adult. An important part of decolonising the study and practice of religion in Australia is to keep naming and retelling this sort of history of Christianity, and to not overlook the witness and the writing of Aboriginal peoples who have been doing this work for such a long time. And then another key strategy in dislocating like a kind of British Christian history of Australia is to focus, as this project does, on diverse and in some cases older movements of religions and cultures and peoples across oceans and into this continent. As Enqi was saying, when we look to the west and the north of the Australian continent, stories of religious and cultural exchange, which differ greatly to a story or a myth of a white Christian nation, emerge. So this part of the map draws on the work of Australian historian Henry Reynolds, who argued that the creation of a united white Australia, which was achieved by federation, was actually just an aspiration of the southeastern states and not a reality. It also, as Enqi was saying, responds to the call of Regina Ganter to turn our maps upside down, and suggesting that we can complicate a tidy but inaccurate foundation narrative by reconsidering trade routes and cultural and religious exchange which occurred in the north of the continent and predate European contact in the southeast. Contemporary studies also highlight this sort of rich religious and cultural diversity. So in this map here, I've also got Peter Stevenson's research documenting the lives of Aboriginal Muslims. And from this research team, Monica Winanita's work exploring the creation and reception of Ramayana dances by Srikandi Dance Group in Perth, which shows that religious dance can be an important form of cultural exchange and potentially a method of community building. Also, Australian ethnomusicologist Jenny McCallum describes cultural and religious music practice and exchange across Caucasus Malay Islamic populations, both on Home Island and in Kathmandu in Western Australia. What's interesting to me there, what have I done? I've ruined life. I can't use technology. Theoretically, we were meant to get another slide now. What's interesting to me is that, yay, Winanita and McCullum are writing about religion, but their work sits in other academic homes, so ethnomusicology, performance studies, media studies, these sorts of disciplines. So a key question that emerges for me when I was kind of putting this literature review together is a question that I'm borrowing from sociologist of religion Meredith Maguire, which is, what do we miss if we only look for religion, or if we're only looking in the sociology of religion? As I was preparing this literature review, I spent many undocumented hours looking for work by Aboriginal scholars in the field of sociology of religion. I contacted a friend who is in an Indigenous Studies department and asked her, and she said no one in that department specifically worked in this field. But in that search, I read It's Like Going to a Cemetery and Lighting a Candle, Aboriginal Australians, Sorry Business and Social Media by Bronwyn Carlson and Ryan Fraser. It's a few years old now, but it was a brilliant read. Carlson and Fraser don't frame their work as studying religion. I don't even think they use the word at all. Rather, they're interested in the adoption and adaptation of media and technology for cultural practices related to death and mourning. However, if religion is anything, then it might be about understanding mortality and what we do when someone dies. And I imagine a lot of us in this room probably agree with that. So surely then it would be pertinent to consider research that looks at these sorts of cultural practices as also a religion. So for me, part of doing knowledge production differently and being self-reflexive of my own work and then the discipline that I kind of sit in might be about being honest about what and who I include, and to advocate for a lot more creativity and flexibility in research design and what counts as relevant literature. And so I think the last part of my map that isn't on there yet, but I want to kind of always go back to, is what am I missing?
Thanks so much, Rosie. That was great. Look, I really just want to come back to where we started a little bit late, so we're running a little bit late here, but we'll play a bit catch up because we do have a bit of time for this workshop. So you will see, I just want to run through how this workshop will be run. We have invited 2 presenters for every session. Each presenter will speak for 20 minutes, and then we have a collective time of discussion after. So we've allocated 40 minutes for discussion. We haven't really allocated any breaks in between. So if every session chair can just keep the discussions within 35 minutes, that would be great, and we can have a bit of a break. I should note that there were some changes of presenters along the way, for various reasons, largely due to the unpredictable nature of the climate we find ourselves in after 2 years. You can also see that we've kept the workshop in terms of numbers small. There are probably more people online at this point. And it's really kept small so that we can have good conversations, we can practice deep listening, and we can participate, from our own research perspectives and experiences. Most of you are scholars. Many of you are also practitioners, and there are also activists amongst you. We have tried to be as inclusive as possible across presenters and participants, and I really hope that we have done justice to that. So this is really, the aims of the workshop that we hope to achieve over this 1.5 days. And we hope that, I guess to say the main thing that we hope to do is to generate new network opportunities between disciplines and between scholars and practitioners that can hopefully lead to collaborative research opportunities in the future. And more will be discussed in day 2 in the final session. And I do invite all of you who are interested to tune in then. All right, that's it from me. And I'm going to hand over to...
Yeah.
Okay. Someone.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank Rosa and Enqi, Rosie and Enqi. I wanted to thank you for the brilliant work in providing the overview of the projects. So that is the excellent work, and these are the committee. Now I wanted to trace one thing. So the team that I've just presented, including myself and Rosie, Emily and Enqi leading us, we are guided by Associate Professor Anna, and also Professor Ian. So these are our, people that guide us in this project. Now, with that, I wanted to welcome Joanna, who is going to share the next session, which Professor Ian is going to present.